Hopefully not, but we can talk to those guys.
Yeah.
I'm trying to, remove therefore and however from the English language, but not very successful.
I'm trying to remove should.
I also like to get rid of that. Should's hard to, if you get rid of should though, you have to do.
That's right. There is no should. There is only do.
It's a beautiful day.
Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
We don't have a
Just so you know, those microphones pick up your voices and
Punch one of those
broadcast.
windows out, maybe.
Did you all hear that?
What?
That bar above your head is a microphone. It is live,
Okay.
and you're broadcasting onto YouTube right now.
Now,
Okay.
for how long have we been doing that?
Maybe a minute. I don't know. Probably a minute.
Okay,
It doesn't necessarily pick you up, but it could.
well, there was some off-color.
My hearing, we should check back on it later.
If the 3 rules of plumbing come up, it wasn't wrong.
Okay, it's now 3 o'clock, so I'm calling a special meeting of the Town of Gibsons Council to order. And I will acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territories of the Squamish Nation. And we have one item of agenda, really, and that's the welcome BC Timber Sales here to present to us. And we need to approve that agenda first. So moved by Councillor Kroll, seconded by Councillor Thompson. All those in favor? That motion carries. Is Councillor DeAndrade with us?
Yes.
Okay. I can't see her voting, but she's there. Okay. Okay, so we've adopted the agenda, and now we're just going straight to the report. So welcome, BC Timber Sales, and I see you've got a number of representatives here, so maybe you can start by introducing yourselves and go from there.
Yeah, just kind of waiting for
Okay.
to pop up here, but yeah, while we're waiting, I guess to go through introductions. My name is Pierre Alvin, and thank you for having this special council meeting for us to present this report to you. I'm a practice sourcer with the BCTS Sunshine Coast Field Team.
And I'm Tom Johnson. I'm the Woodlands Manager for BC Timber Sales. So I look after the operational side of our business. I'm your Timber Sales Manager, who actually is the manager for all of Chinook, which is our business area. And so at BCTS, provincially, BCTS manages about 20% of the AAC of the province. And then in Chinook, we have operating area in Chilliwack, Squamish, Haida Gwaii, and Sunshine Coast.
Hi, I'm Jocelyn Tornello. I am the Woodland Supervisor for the Sunshine Coast Field Team.
Hi, I'm Chelsea Friedman. I'm the Indigenous Relations Liaison for the Sunshine Coast Field Team.
And my name is Lars Unilla. I'm a consulting hydrologist with Polar Geoscience out of Squamish.
And I'm Robbie Johnson. I'm a project hydrologist working for Lars with Polar Geoscience.
So today we're presenting the Mount Elphinstone South Watershed Assessment Phase 1 and 2 of our 3-phase watershed assessment report. I'd also like to acknowledge that that we're currently meeting today on the traditional territories of the Squamish Nation, and that this report covers areas that are also within the Squamish Nation. Mic's on now. And that they have been stewards of the land since time immemorial. So how did we get here? In March 2020, after discussions with landowners and stakeholders, adjacent to the BCTS chart area on the Mount Elphinstone slopes. It was decided that a three-phase comprehensive study of the watershed conditions was a necessary next step for us. So phase one was kind of a review of the available data to kind of get the background information, as well as some field review to confirm that background information. Phase two was more ground-based review of water licenses and to confirm different conditions within the channel, stream areas. And then currently we're at the release of this report in the draft phase to present the findings and recommendations to like town of Gibsons and other land managers to help disseminate the information and like really keep everyone in the loop, I guess, as to what we've found in this report. And then the next phase of this three-phase report will be to actually look at specific planned BCTS developments and within the context of phase 1 and 2. So
Could I just ask that we get the presentation only on the screen right now, just because when it's half screen, it's, yeah, thanks. And are you open to questions throughout, or should we wait until the end?
I think questions interspersed is good.
Okay, so I'll just ask Councillor DeAndrade, just speak up if you have a question, because we can't see you on the screen right now because we need to see the presentation, so.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, we can hear you, so that works, great.
One of the things to emphasize here is, what we're doing with this watershed assessment is way beyond what we're required to do under forest legislation. And, we recognize the sensitivity of operating above this large rural area. And so that's one of the real reasons that we've hired Lars and Robbie to dig into this.
And yeah, just to kind of wrap up the preamble here, the objectives of this are to present the phase 1 and 2 report, to share the information, findings, and recommendation, just to kind of foster a greater understanding of the current conditions within these watersheds that were assessed, to allow opportunity for discussions and findings recommended, including like this establishment of disturbance targets and management options. And also just this is still in the draft phase of this report, so we'd also be looking for any additional comments and considerations that might be useful to include in the final version of this report. So with that, I'll hand it over to Lars and Robbie, and they can run through the actual report itself. So I guess we just need, nope.
Well, thanks for all taking the time out of your day today to listen to our talk. As Pierre said, our draft report for Mount Elphinstone watershed assessment was recently released to the public. And as part of the engagement process, we are now currently welcoming comment on the report. For today, I was asked by Timber Sales to summarize our report, which is sitting here in hard copy, and it's some 200 pages. I'll try to be as brief as I can, but it is rather technical. And again, if you have some questions, certainly interject and I'll try to answer those. But a lot of the details are really in that draft report. So if something I kind of skim, it's in the report. And if you have any follow-up questions after that, the best contact is probably Pierre at Timber Sales to get any further word. So this was a multidisciplinary team. Our company, Polar Geoscience, myself, I'm a senior hydrologist and geoscientist. Robbie's the hydrologist who's worked on it, and we had a few other firms, Foresight and Range River Consulting, and those provided mostly technical assistance. And we had the fortune of having Dr. Bill Floyd, who's the provincial research hydrologist, do a peer review of some of the early drafts. So before we put it out to the public. So the outline today is in four main parts. I'll talk first about the background and kind of what is an assessment like this, talk about some of the framework and the methods we use. And I'll go in and touch on the condition and sensitivity of the watersheds that we assessed above the slopes of Gibsons. And then I'll look into discussing the risks that we identified and the risk mitigation that we are forwarding as recommendations to timber sales to try to keep the risks at bay. And then I'll summarize with some take-home messages. So what is a watershed assessment? It's a specialist hydrologist often review of a watershed and its streams with a focus on the hydrologic, so that's like water and flooding, and geomorphic, think landslides, processes that could pose a hazard or compromise water supply and quality. And as I say there, they include flooding, landslides, soil erosion, stream channel destabilization, water quality impacts, and low stream flows. So a watershed, just by definition, is an area of land that drains to a stream network and then exits at a common outlet. Groundwater flow is included in the watershed, of course, although the boundaries may not coincide exactly with the surface water boundaries. And I may use the word catchment or drainage area, that's synonymous to watershed. And it's important to recognize that the watersheds are nested, so smaller ones feed larger ones. And we use terms such as watershed to speak to the larger unit and go to smaller units, basins and subbasins. And we use that because often we're looking at different scale issues and we have to speak to those areas. Oh, there we go. So a watershed assessment, our focus is often on surface water hydrology, the stream flows, erosion and sedimentation, riparian, streamside vegetation, and stream channel stability. And I want to make this emphasis that we recognize and address the risks to groundwater recharge, which are very important for the town of Gibsons. But this, we're not claiming this to be a detailed hydrogeology investigation. Downstream values potentially at risk are identified. We look at the potential hydrologic and geomorphic hazards and risks with forest development. And then we ultimately try to provide guidance to reduce, mitigate, or avoid those risks with forest development. And we provide those to the forest managers, in this case, BC Timber Sales. And here's another important point. The specialists, such as ourselves, we identify the risk, but we don't determine whether that is acceptable or not. That's the role of the forest professionals to manage. So BCTS has recently developed a watershed risk management framework, and that was the structural document that guided our assessment, and it's developed in response to the Joint Professional Practice Guidelines that was put out in 2020. And it's intended to help meet the requirements of the Professional Governance Act that came into force in 2021. And it really, what it does is provide a structured process, so consistent application of the methods, depending on, doesn't matter who the consultant is, we have consistency across the board. So that's what we're working with. It's a new thing in the last few years, and it's just getting traction now throughout the province. So the assessment we're talking about today is the Mount Elphinstone South assessment, and it's currently in draft. And we are welcoming comment. There very well could be some omissions that we've made that we would like to hear about. But it is a fairly thorough document at over 200 pages, so we have put a fair bit of effort in it, and probably at a level of intensity and rigor that is far above most of these types of assessments that are done in the province, because we recognize, again, the sensitivity of the downslope areas. We included the compilation and use of high-resolution LiDAR data, which is really monumental in identifying this precise streams and the drainages that those streams capture. A lot of the legacy maps that we have prior to using LiDAR information are not accurate in reality. And unfortunately, we've noticed that as we're kind of referring back to some of the legacy maps, it's often kind of challenging because now we've got a new map and these creeks are now precisely, like we've got 1 meter resolution on our maps now. That before you'd be lucky if you get 100 meters, right? So using that LiDAR and the general area downslope of timber sales that we were interested in, we had eight watersheds. Chaster Creek, Endwalker Creek, Smales Creek, Higgs Brook, Slater Creek, Molyneux Creek, Joe Smith Creek, and Clough Creek. So the assessment objectives were to determine the likelihood of specific hazards occurring under current conditions, which are a legacy of past disturbances, and then looking into the future post-development or post-plan development. Even though we don't have specific plans at this time, that's in phase 3, we're looking into the future and trying to speculate based on what we can see in the sensitivity of the landscape, what we believe those future conditions might look like and the risks associated with those. So in technical jargon, we're doing a partial risk analysis, which identifies the type of hazard and the likelihood of affecting a value downstream. So there are many steps in risk assessment, many types, and you can go very detailed. We tried to keep it at a high level. We're covering a large area. We don't examine the vulnerability or robustness necessarily of those downstream values. So that's an important point. An approach that we took when we were recommending options was to try to do our best to suggest that a minimum or low hazard was maintained within BC Timber Sales operating area. So that's within their control largely. And avoiding measurably increasing existing hazards downstream. So those are the areas, like the urban areas here, rural areas, that are outside of timber sales control. So that was kind of a guiding approach when we were trying to build recommendations. And it is a challenge because we are in an urban interface and water goes downhill. So there's three main parts to our assessments. We did an office review where we do a thorough review of previous work in the area, relevant research literature on some of the topics that are of importance here in forest hydrology. Compiled a lot of background information on the geology, soils, vegetation, the groundwater studies that Gibsons had commissioned, climate change data, stream flow data, land use, past forest disturbance. We analyzed a whole suite of probably several hundred air photos looking back to 1947 to try to get a good picture of what happened across the landscape. And we developed this accurate base map that we have a copy here after the meeting you're welcome to look at. And we characterize forest canopy heights using high resolution LiDAR. And that's another new tool that helps us get a better picture of the stand characteristics.
Are you guys all familiar with LiDAR? Sort of what it does?
Okay, well,
Okay.
LiDAR. So it's basically a remote sensing method where an airplane flies, shoots basically light beams, and then gets a map that is so fine grained. It's kind of it's really surprising actually when you see it. I'll show a picture in a second.
Basically allows you to separate the land and the treetops with the reflection of the laser beams back to the receiver. And so we can come up with accurate estimates of tree height and also accurate estimates of the land underneath the forest canopy.
Yeah. Okay, and then so we move out of the office work into more of the field work, and we conducted 3 weeks of field work over the last couple of years. Visited with licensed water users. BC Timber Sales reached out by sending letters to all of them, and those who had feedback and a positive response, we went and visited. We drove all the accessible roads in the area and reviewed the streams at as many locations as we could. This is a bit of a point. This is the points that we visited. So we covered a lot of ground. So Gibsons is kind of on the right there. So you have Chester and moving through all those stream catchments that you can see there. And we tried to get into as many points to characterize these streams. I think we did a reasonable job of that, considering the challenges, private land and so forth. In the third part, we analyzed and developed the draft report. One of the important steps is we model what is known as hydrologic recovery of the forests. I'll speak to that in the next slide. We identify the hazards and the values downstream, and looking at those two, we assess the risks to those values. And then finally, the risk management options are that we forward to timber sales. So hydrologic recovery. So research has found that peak flows, or the floods, can be related to the level of natural or human disturbance in a catchment. So hydrologic recovery describes how a regenerating forest compares to old growth stands in terms of its ability to intercept precipitation and influence snow accumulation and melt. So in other words, the hydrology coming off a certain location. So in that diagram on the right there, you can see as tree heights increase, that hydrologic recovery can rapidly increase, and eventually it comes to a point close to 100%, which is near what a theoretical old growth stand would be, okay? So hydrologic recovery is related to a metric that we use called ECA, equivalent clear-cut area. And that is the proportion of a drainage area that is effectively behaving from a hydrologic perspective as if it were clear-cut. And so that's that we measure that in hectares or percent of a catchment. So when the recovery is 100%, so say it's all behaving like an old growth, ECA is 0. And vice versa, if the ECA is 100, that's effectively mean the whole catchment is cut. Okay. So forestry effects on peak flows may be detectable when that ECA catchment wide reaches about 20%. Okay. And that's based on a lot of literature over the last several decades. Okay. So there may be some debate on plus or minus a few percent one way or the other. 20% is usually the level where a relatively sensitive watershed would start to, the effects of logging start to be seen in the creeks, okay? And we measure that ECA by calculating the tree stand, the heights, and we use that advanced technology, the LiDAR, to measure that. So we have a fairly accurate representation of the landscape and the heights. So this image, aerial image, shows in that lower center area there, you know, that's a fairly mature stand, and that's 100% recovered. Up on the top there, we have a recent block that's harvested with maybe a few residual trees left, and that would be at 1% recovery or 99% ECA. And then you have a few examples of intermediate steps. So we can gauge any type of stand and give it a value, an ECA value, and then we can sum those up for any catchment to give a basin or catchment wide value, okay? So in terms of the Mount Elphinstone South watershed condition and sensitivity, that's a bit of a 3D image of the area showing the 8 catchments. They're all relatively small, between 100 and 1,000 hectares, Chester being the largest of them all by far. And they all similarly respond rapidly to rainfall. So as soon as a rainfall event comes, the creeks are running. And we can see that when we look at some of the stream flow records from the region. We don't have any records, long-term records in this area. I know that town of Gibsons and I think Waterline have been establishing some stream flow gauges. In terms of the provincial or the federal water records, I think the closest one is Roberts Creek. Yeah. Yes. Councillor Thompson.
Back to the last image when you were, do you have even make one?
This one?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, sorry, just because it hangs into the next question. When you're comparing those percentages like that, it's a snapshot in time of, and so that snapshot represents at that moment, or is it that season or that year? What period does that represent?
Yeah, so the number isn't too sensitive on that point in time. It's about a year plus or minus a bit. Because the amount of recovery, like a tree growth and the recovery represented by, say, a tree at, a seedling, it's going to be relatively low, recovery until it gets to probably 3 meters, to be honest. So yeah, it's about a year. And regarding that, we also look, because as trees grow, these numbers change, right? So we do projections out. And in our case, we've done projections out to 50 years. If, looking at the current state of the watersheds, this is what it is now, this is what it is through to 50 years. We can do that also by superimposing a harvest plan. We didn't have specific ones that we're looking at in this case, but we could put that and say, okay, this has now bumped up our ECA 10% in this watershed. How long is that 10% gonna last? It may go down over 15, 20 years, back to zero. So yeah, it's a good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Another aspect of this area is the high density of parallel stream drainages. That's a relic of the glacial landscape and the soils we have here. So there's rather quite a few streams in there, and part of the challenge of originally pulling this all together was, again, without the LiDAR, it was hard to tell where one creek started and one creek ended accurately. And now we have a good accurate base. Soils are generally shallower above and much thicker below, obviously, and on the Gibson bench there with the aquifer, we know that. An aspect of these watersheds that we don't have much storage in terms of lakes and wetlands, so that plays into some of the characteristics. And these are all urban interface watersheds with residential and commercial development on lower slopes, which is, as a hydrologist working through the province, this is a relatively unique situation because the forest land base covers such huge areas, and it's those lovely times when we come to hit a point where now we've got an urban interface. Makes things more challenging for sure. So we recognize climate change when we're putting these reports together, and we I won't go through the details necessarily here, but all the numbers point to an increased drought potential from climate change and an increased flood potential in the winter. And in spite of the warming temperatures, we're still going to have snowfall events like we've had this winter that come down quite far down to the sea level. So we have to expect that rain on snow events, which are the real driver of the biggest, most damaging floods. They could still occur. So we try to think about all this when we're putting our management options, risk management options together. So, as I said, we looked back into the historical record and looked at, this is a mosaic of photos from 1947. And the lower slopes show widespread evidence of wildfire, post-wildfire forest recovery and logging. And we know that there's historical documents suggesting or identifying some of these events too. So it corroborates with what we're seeing on the maps. We see really these patchy, dense stands are post-wildfire stands in many cases. And by 1947, we can see that there was some logging, and the road that comes up on the upper left there that's the Roberts Creek Forest Service Road. So those were in by 1947. I'd like you to pay attention to that purple oval. So in 2003, that's what the trees looked like. So that's what we're trying to demonstrate. That's what hydrologic recovery is. And that same location is shown on this map, which is a map of the forest heights. Okay, so by 2021, those areas that were logged in 1947 are now in excess of 30 meters tall. And the recovery is getting there. So it's a slow process, but it does occur over time. So on the lower slopes, we have residential and commercial use. And it's been widespread, and obviously it can affect the conditions, the drainage conditions, the runoff conditions in these watersheds. So we went to the effort of extracting all those areas where forest cover has been removed for urban development. And that's what those pink areas are. So those pink areas use the high resolution LiDAR data plus a forest inventory expert who went through that and actually drew all of those little circles there that you see. It's a fair bit of effort. The intention of that is so that we can capture a full picture of the forest cover removal in any given watershed. This plot basically just shows what percentages of those each of those 8 watersheds has some of this residential or commercial area in it. And some of them, like Chester Creek and Walker Creek, the numbers are relatively high, and that's going to influence that ECA number that I mentioned earlier. So where I said 20% is where we speak about potential impacts, well, we are already over 25% in Chester and 45%. And so the ECAs will never go back down there unless you start revegetating, planting more in the town area or the lower rural or urban area. In terms of usage of surface water resources, there's 59 currently registered in these 8 watersheds. And based on our review and meetings with people that provided permission to cross their land, we only identified about 9 of them as confirming that they were in use and active. A lot of them are either damaged or inactive, and several of them we couldn't get to because of access limitations. So that was just a picture that we were trying to see how many people are actually using it versus using, say, the municipal system. And the infrastructure they have for all these private intakes, it varies across the board. And but the general sense is that a lot of this is quite vulnerable. It's in-stream stuff, so if you have a pump or some pipes, they're all exposed to potential damage from sediment moving downstream and so forth. So it is that's what we identified. Groundwater, the resources here, we have about 94 wells. Does that include the town of Gibsons well? I think it might.
So, yeah.
And so we have a sense of where those are downslope and which aquifers they are tapping in. I think I might have a point here. Yeah, so about 42 of those are into the Roberts Creek aquifer, and 30 into the Gibsons. Is that number 5?
560.
560. Yeah. The remaining 22 wells don't have a named aquifer they're attributed to. And we did meet with some of the private well owners, and the questions that we heard come up were, they were asking whether harvesting may affect their groundwater recharge and affect their water supply and quality. So that was something we put on our table to think about. You've probably seen figures like these. This is a kind of a rehash of the information that from Waterline. But we're trying to get a sense that we understand some of the details. I know there is a fair bit out there. Regarding aquifer recharge, the bulk of it is during the fall and winter. And we have kind of this mountain block recharge which comes off the hill slope Some of it coming down gullies and streams and some of it going through the bedrock. And then you have some of the younger water infiltrating through from direct precipitation onto the Gibson bench and making its way whether into the main Gibsons aquifer at 560 or the upper one, Capilano aquifer. Fisheries, the most noteworthy fisheries is in Lower Chester Creek. But they've also been recorded or suspected near the mouths of End or Walker Creek, Molyneux, and Clough Creek. Now, we're not doing a fisheries study, but from what we saw out there, the distributions of fish in these streams appears to be limited by a lot of steep bedrock stream sections, hanging culverts, like in that photo, or even waterfalls. And this is a provincial data set that shows the registered or the observed fish sightings on the creeks. We're aware that there may be some more local stream keeper information out there. That's not on this data specifically, but it really does show how Chester and Lower Chester, up to about the 2K mark, that's where a waterfall is. And so the anadromous species aren't going to get past that waterfall at about 2K. Oh, that was a fast clip. Sorry. Okay. So since our time is short today, I just wanted to touch on Chester Creek and leave the other 7 outside of this discussion. But Chester really is the largest stream with many tributaries, a lot of incised deep gullies in the upper portion. I mentioned the waterfall preventing fish passage. There's some steep bouldery bedrock channels in the upper end, and then they come down onto the lower bench, and you have lower gradient streams with boulders and cobbles, an alluvial channel which is a little more variable. And one thing that was noteworthy was the amount of sediment that we have depositing near the mouth of the creek, which could have had some effect on the fish values down there. That's our speculation. So we identified 11 currently registered licensed in the Chester Creek. We identified 31 stream crossings, so that's both Resource Road and in the town, the lower end. Fish species near the mouth and Chester House is another value that we know has been affected by flooding in the past. Okay. So here's the part where I'd like to speak to some of the risks or the hazards, the processes that we examined and some of the options that we're forwarding to timber sales. Oh, did we miss? No. So this table basically shows kind of how we examine the hazards and the main ones being peak flows or flooding, low flows and aquifer recharge, sediment yields, which is basically erosion and deposition of sediment in streams, channel instability, and contamination by pollutants. And we tally those up for different values that we identified for each of those creeks. We do use a number of qualitative ratings in the report, and this here is trying to give some context in terms of what that is mathematically from a probability sense. And so when we are making recommendations, oftentimes we're saying we want to keep those risks low or very low. And so these are the numbers that we suggest. They're quite small on a probability over 1 year. And if we take that probability and we do a little math and you put it towards 10 years or 20 years, top and bottom on the right, the numbers are relatively small still. And so within probably about in 20 years, something with a low probability would have something like up to maybe 2% chance of happening. So that's 2 in 100 chance of happening, which is I just wanted to put that context out there, so when we're talking about that. So the first hazard that we looked at was peak flows or flooding. And we use this term peak flow hazard. Now, it's not, we have to be careful because some might think, when I think of flood hazard, I just think, oh, that creek has flooded last year, the hazard must be high. That's not exactly what we're looking at. We're looking at the likelihood that flooding on a stream or a particular stream reach has or will become measurably more severe or frequent relative to this old growth baseline forest condition that we're looking at. So we're looking at really, and it's all based in a bunch of research literature that look at modeling. Here's a watershed that's never been cut. Here's a watershed that's been cut, 10% or more. So we're looking at those hazards, and you move up that scale, the hazard increases. So we look at the current conditions, what are they like right now? And that's a legacy of what's happened in the past. So going back 100 years, we had those wildfires that came through here. We had logging that happened. Things have grown up, things have been cut down. But where are we right now? That's what the first scenario. And then looking to the future is the next step. Given those characteristics that I noted earlier, the area we classify it as a high runoff generation potential. So what it means is these streams are quite sensitive to forest cover removal on the sensitive end of scale. And so what that does is, from our perspective, we have to go and actually shift that peak flow hazard. So we may be in another watershed tomorrow where the peak flow hazard may not be as high because of various characteristics. It may have huge lakes or wetlands or something that slows water through it. Here we have kind of quite the opposite. We have a sensitive system. So we put forward a number of criteria based on that metric ECA that we mentioned earlier. So based on these percentages, less than 20%, we believe that's a low peak flow hazard, and it incrementally increases as you go up the scale. So this was a complex urban interface watershed, and probably one of the most complex I have seen in my 30 years of doing this. And that's why this report actually took quite a while, is one of the reasons, is because the complexity. So we actually ended up putting 30 points of interest on our map because we wanted to make sure that when we calculated these ECA values, the areas that were disturbed upslope of a certain point, we could kind of gauge how that changed as we moved down each and every stream system. And that's what all these points are here in a schematic. So the ECA is on this map is showing that ECA in color codes from green to red. So the higher the number, the green represents mature stands. The red represents stands that have little vegetation on it, or short vegetation. So, what we have in a lot of these interface watersheds is a major influence by the residential and commercial development. At the same time, in the upper area, we do have forest harvesting, but at this point in time, the numbers are heavily biased by that lower portion of the watershed. So when we look at applying this peak flow hazard rating to each of these 30 points of interest, we get values for this ECA metric that range from 6 to 57. Remind you about that 20% is where we think is a kind of a break point from low to a moderate hazard. And the hazard generally increases as you move downstream, and that's when you go from the green to the yellow to the red. So we have several yellow points near the lower ends of several of those are highway crossings, and then near the mouths, and Chester Creek and that end, or Walker Creek, are also fairly high. So this is where I could go very much into technical details. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible. But an example here is now to show, okay, we understand what the current situation is like. What do we recommend to timber sales so that we can manage this watershed sustainably? So we have 8 points of interest there. 4 of them are at the boundary of the timber sales operating area, which is that pink line. And 4 capture areas with more of that residential commercial area. And what we have to do when we're looking at this, we have to, obviously water flows downhill and ECAs, these metrics accumulate as you go downstream. So we really have to think through the whole watershed and think of all these points of interest almost simultaneously. Because, you know, it's no point if you protect one area at the expense of another. So this slide here basically looks at the examination of current conditions exclusively in the operating area. And as you saw in that previous slide, there's not a lot of harvesting in this particular drainage. So those ECAs all rank at a low. So there's 4 points of interest. You look on the right, they're all low rankings at this point. But moving forward, the management approach that we're trying to recommend to timber sales is to maintain these currently low peak flow hazards within all the catchments in its operating area. So it's not just Chester, but all the catchments across the Elphinstone face. We're saying do everything you can within your operating area to keep that a low hazard. So low hazard comes off of their, I guess, operating area. But at the same time, we have to be conscious and avoid increases in peak flow hazard that are currently in place at these downstream locations. Now, if you can remember back to that bar chart that I had where there was a 25 or 35 and a 50, that's our limitation. We can't go lower than that in some of the areas down lower. So that's why we're saying avoid increases. We can't, if I could say decrease those, I'd love to, but we have no control over that. So, so do I go forward or backward there?
Backwards.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So here's an example of where we start thinking of those downstream points of interest. And this point here is a point called Chester Creek above Shirley. It currently has a low hazard because it has a 17%. And we're saying, whatever you do up top there in those colored watersheds up top, make sure that the number, as you calculate it at this point, doesn't exceed 20%. And so the magic increase for that is 2.8% increase as measured at that point. So that actually sets constraint what happens up in that purple watershed, for example. Okay, 2.8% equals 11.4 hectares on the left. So that means we're telling timber sales, we're recommending if you want to keep low hazard in the operating area and a low hazard at this point of interest, you're going to have to keep the harvest level below 11.4% at this time. Now, if you took this analysis 20 years from now, that number would be different because trees grow. And so we did that at multiple points all the way around. So we have 4 more points. The problem is this point here was already low. As you get down to the mouth, it's a high risk because we're already at 33%, I think. And I'll flip to that because I think it's worth, I have examples. Yeah, so here we have an ECA that's 33% at the mouth of Chester. And what we're trying to do is, well, actually this constraint that we say 2.5% is the maximum that can increase. That constraint is actually driven by another consideration in the watershed. It means that the high risk is not a high peak flow hazard is not going to change measurably. Yes, the percentage goes up incrementally, but not, we don't believe that will change it measurably. And that will be one of the constraints. So this is the whole picture. It's a kind of a challenging thing to explain, but it's this approach is rather novel in forest hydrology, and I don't know if it's ever been applied anywhere else in the province to consider all these the interface points of interest. You know, if this was done 10 years ago, you'd probably hear someone talk about those upper watersheds, and then they would go at it and go logging, and they wouldn't think about the lower end. So we're really trying to think of that lower end, and even though we can't improve situations, we're trying to minimize any incremental damage downstream.
If you flip that around, if you go back to that for a
That
second.
one? Yeah.
No, that-
That one?
Yeah, that one. So to maintain that high means that from the logging side of it, you could add 27 hectares throughout here.
Right. But based on some of the other
Yeah.
constraints, like say for 5, only about 11 are allowed to come out of that purple area. So we've really finely, again, I don't know if anyone has ever done this, very finely attributed harvest levels to, and these are rather strong constraints. I mean, from a forester's perspective, I'm not a forester, I'm a hydrologist, but it's a pretty strong constraint. But we believe that this is warranted based on the risks. We know that, Councillor Lumley?
Yeah, thanks for your report. It's, I think the way you've explained it is quite clear. I'm sorry, but in the back of my mind, I just keep thinking for BCTS, like, why harvest at all? Like, you've got like considerably, based on the area, kind of low yields, and the risks are, I just, hold on a second here. There's a couple of things I just want to touch on, but the reports, the information's obviously great to add to all the information we have, but at one point you said the information you're providing is so that forestry professionals decide acceptable risk. So the first thing that went in my mind, why wouldn't the community decide the acceptable risk? Why does forestry get to decide the acceptable risk to potentially damaging our watershed? The other thing is, and you admitted to doing extra work because this area is so sensitive. So again, my brain goes, then why log? Like, why are we just compounding all these risks? Now, just recently, we received a waterline update, and we actually had a meeting where we were given instructions, or at least direction on how to put this report strategy to protect our watersheds. Now, I know we haven't, I don't even know if we've budgeted any funds for it yet, but it was a pretty detailed, it was identify potential contaminant sources for the aquifer, so a comprehensive analytical program can be developed, investigate upper reaches of Chester Creek and Gibson watersheds to assess any aquifer lobes, install additional monitoring wells. Like, this is like a list of things, including a watershed management plan, a risk management policy, water sustainability plan, groundwater sustainability assessment. These are all things that we have to do. We haven't done them yet, but we're going to work with the regional district. I just wonder why, before these things are done, I guess my main question is why by BCTS, and I'm not saying this work's not important, believe me, I'm not, but why not just like wait and say, okay, we don't want to potentially risk. I mean, I think we're like one of 2 communities in all of BC that don't chlorinate their drinking water because of our aquifer. A community that's, I don't know, won awards. We have a national natural asset, distinction around the world. I don't know. We're sitting here discussing potential risks for all of that, and I just don't know if it's worth it. Even for BCTS, I don't know if it's worth it. Like, why would that potential risk be worth, maybe it just doesn't mean anything. I guess if something bad happens or something, our recharge area is affected by logging, but I mean, to the whole community it would be. I just not sure why any risk. I know there's some risk and there's gonna be these acceptable risks, but to me, it just doesn't seem like it's even worth the risk. So I just don't understand why they'd be logging, that's all.
So I'll
Thanks.
forward that question to Tom here from Timber Sales.
So, I mean, the land use decision at this point is that this area is part of the timber harvesting land base. And that's where the province and users.
Could you use the mic just
Oh, yep, sorry. Yep. So at this point, you know, the area above the purple line is considered to be, the land use designation for that is for forestry. And there isn't, you know, community watershed designated there, which, you know, we operate in other community watersheds in the province, in our area. So it is considered, you know, a forest land use. And that's why we're there, you know, in the distribution of operating areas within the Sunshine Coast Timber Supply Area. BCTS has been assigned to, or agreed to operate in this area. Currently, we log annually about half of the available volume that could be logged under there, under the current timber supply review and the AAC that's calculated out of that. So we have, and then on top of that, you know, if we don't, you know, we have an assigned AAC for the Sunshine Coast timber supply area, which we're supposed to deliver on a 5-year business cycle. And if we didn't log here, which produces timber in the AAC calculations, we'd have to log more somewhere else so that we deliver our commitment to the province. So it's not just as simple for us as saying, well, Town of Gibsons wants us to stop. We need a land use designation that removes this area from the timber harvesting land base. For us, you know, for us not to be there, or any other licensee not to be there, right? Because if, you know, the other side of that is, if we're not operating here, somebody else can operate there.
Through Mr. Mayor, just a question, I was just trying to understand that sort of using that line as a sort of a separating two approaches, I guess. Sort of try, where's the value, where does it come in sort of in terms of the value of restoring the lower portions to try to reduce those ECAs versus reducing the activity upstream or above the line per se? Or is there sort of a balance in between? Because for us, restoration is one of our only hopes, in particularly in the areas that we have a little bit more of control over. But we've got these, I don't think it's all lost in the lower portion, irrespective of what decision is made about the harvesting areas. But
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we do see more snow up in the upper watershed, and that has an influence on the, you know, the runoff going into the spring. So there are different effects depending if you're at the lower elevations or the upper elevations. We know that. But these watersheds are also rainfall driven too. So and that tends to be very similar throughout these relatively small watersheds. But what you mentioned there, you know, restoration, you know, planting, you know, moving. I don't doubt that there's efforts to, you know, promote more retention of stormwater. That's always been the theme over the last couple decades in urban areas. And the more that you can do that, you know, the less impact you can have on the streams, of course, because what we're trying to avoid is the synchronization of all the water to hit the stream at the exact same time, because then you have these flashy peak flows. If you can delay things wherever you can, it's tough because these watersheds are characteristically pretty flashy. There's very little storage on the surface.
Thompson first.
I share your concerns, Councillor Lemley. I'm hearing things, noteworthy fish presence, aquifer risks, urban interface challenges, major complexity of this area. In your response, you indicated a land use decision. Can you tell me what % this represents this area represents in that land use decision of?
Well, we harvest about 27,000 cubic meters a year from this area, plus the Roberts Creek set of watersheds.
Can you put that in a rough percentage so that I can understand what area would this, just roughly, what does this represent in your whole picture of axis of land use area? Please.
Well, in terms of the AAC that BCTS has in the Sunshine Coast, it's what, 10%?
This is about 10% of the whole axis that you have.
10% of our harvest
Area.
our allocated harvest area,
Got it, okay, thank you.
roughly.
I have a question.
Oh, you've got Councillor Kroll first.
Okay.
And then we'll go to you.
You mentioned that you take into consideration climate impact. I've noticed in areas on the coast, for example, the area around the Sprockets Bike Park last fall, we had a major weather event, and there was a huge number of trees that were brought down by the climate impact. So when you refer to this as a snapshot in time, and these are the percentages you're dealing with, how do going to the risk thing, when you get a weather event like that suddenly tips the balance, how do you factor that into your calculations? Or are you just looking at precipitation and snowfall and heat and stuff like that, as opposed to actual wind damage and the loss of inventory?
I would say the latter would be more accurate. I mean, we do look at the processes that are occurring. We have to refer to the research literature that look at a lot of these questions have been done in either a modeling realm or in a research watershed. And we have to use those, the data that we get from those. Numbers like 20%, that's irrespective of the climate change per se. It's a number that is kind of more intrinsic to the sensitivity of the watershed in terms of its response to precipitation events. But when you have driving, a changing driving factor of, atmospheric event coming, we know that's going to happen, and that's happened in the past. It's probably going to happen even more frequently in the future. So it may not have as much of a bearing on some of these constraints that were put forth here, but it may have more constraints, like you mentioned, on wind throw assessments that are done that have to assume wind speeds may increase with the more energy that we're generating in the atmosphere. So those assessments have to assume perhaps that wider buffers have to be established. It is a challenge. I won't deny that. I mean, we don't know exactly. We don't have a crystal ball exactly, so we have to go with what we know in terms of the research and moving forward carefully. And what we're trying to propose at every step of the way here is to try to be conservative and careful moving forward. That's what we're trying to propose. And if this was another area, or if climate change was not on the table, something to worry about, no doubt these constraints will be relaxed, because I work throughout the province. So these are actually quite heavy constraints that we're placing here for them. Now, it may not satisfy those that don't want to see logging at all, but from our perspective, these constraints would be backed by the science we have.
Thank you. Councillor DeAndrade.
Thank you. On the conclusions, I read on page 162
that if BCTS maintains current peak flow hazards and a low likelihood of adversely affecting low flows, the risk associated with BCT's development in the assessment area on the groundwater supply are low. But then it talks about sea level increases in the water balance can be expected following the removal of forest cover, and it may result in, sorry, one second. Increases in the groundwater table. However, such increases are only expected to persist for up to 10 to 15 years. Beyond that time, there is a potential for decrease, but only if opening size exceeds 8 hectares or where thinning occurs if more than 50% of the overstory canopy is removed. So I appreciate the level of details, but my question is, this is a recommendation from the hydrologists and other scientists involved in this study, but this is not a decision from BCTS. So my question is, based on your experience, what is the likelihood that BCTS will implement all recommendations without alterations in any limit imposed by the recommendations?
I can speak for BCTS on that question, and we fully intend to endorse the recommendations of this report. And you'll see once we move to the phase 3 analysis of the site level blocks being proposed, that we'll be modifying some of them in accordance with the report, reducing some of the opening sizes within those blocks and changing the configuration of them.
So Mayor, can I ask another question?
Go ahead.
Thank you. So I share obviously the same concerns that Council, and it seems to me, based on the limits imposed, that I'm questioning if this harvesting is economically viable. Is there any study done on top of these recommendations?
This harvesting is economically viable, yes. It's one of our most productive areas that we operate in, Sunshine Coast Timber Supply Area.
I understand, but under this current recommendation, has any analysis been done at this point?
Yes, we have looked at the blocks. We are looking at, opening sizes, and we believe that there's economic value to continue with harvesting here. And in our program, if there wasn't economic value, then we don't sell timber at a loss. We sell it at least at break even in general, so.
I understand, thank you, but this is just, I understand this is a new approach that has not been tested yet.
And I think Michelle Lewis, our natural assets technician, has a question online as well.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have a question about the recommendation to do with determining how many hectares could be logged without increasing the risk rating. What about, and also to follow onto that conversation about restoration projects downstream that the town or the SCRD could be doing to minimize impacts there. I wonder if there's a recommendation, or there could be recommendations from the hydrologists about ways to mitigate the effects other than just stopping logging at a certain percentage or a certain hectare amount. Like, for example, if we're talking about stormwater management, then could there be recommendations about implementation strategies downstream as far as like revegetation or stormwater pond, putting in more stormwater ponds, and that could be supported by BC Timber Sales, since they're the ones that are creating the impact downstream?
I will defer that to the municipality who's responsible for and the regional district, below our operating area.
If I may, Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, sure.
But I would suggest that if that's something you have a tenure up there, and this is part of your land use tenure, but if it is causing cumulative impacts downstream, would that not be something that the timber sales could be helping with?
Well, I would say if you look at the ECA, the cumulative impacts are within the town, within the rural or the urban section. And our ECAs are, around 6% above the line. And so I don't, we're happy to share this report with you, but I'm not sure that I see the linkage between us and planning the management within the jurisdiction of the regional district.
And municipality, yeah. Okay. And the municipality.
Yeah.
No doubt, yeah.
The line is higher in the regional, yeah, exactly.
Okay. That line of questioning is done. Is the actual?
No, we have lots more.
Yeah, you have lots more. Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah.
So there was some points there brought up. I don't know the counselor's name there online. She brought up some points that we haven't yet talked about. Full screen. Smear. So peak flows are one thing, droughts and summer low flows are another thing, we all know. So we wanted to get a snapshot and understanding of what the hill slopes are like in terms of how we can, should they behave in terms of summer low flows. Okay, now this is rather novel work and we're presenting it here, but just want to put that, it is a draft, sorry, look at that mic. So in collaboration with the province's coastal research hydrologist and following a review of current research, a novel approach was applied to evaluating forest ages to provide some context on the possible effects of past forest disturbance on low flows. So a few of the guiding principles on the uptake of water by trees. Young trees consume more water than old trees. Riparian areas consume more water than upland areas. So it's those areas near streams. And deciduous trees tend to consume more water than conifers. So we looked at, because we have a fairly accurate forest inventory data set on the ages of all the stands on the hill slope, we put those into different classes and we lumped them together based on what we thought their water usage was. It's like saying the bad water users are in this group, and the better water users are in different groups. So we also then tallied those up and looked at how much area each of those, and we gave them hazards from a low flow perspective. So the idea was to say this watershed, we should expect there to be low flow problems because of the forest stand characteristics versus this other watershed that may have different ones. And so what we looked at, and this is only on the timber sales operating area right now. We don't have age data down slope. So that's kind of the pattern. The age classes, so the blue represent those young stands right after harvesting and planting, and they actually produce more water per unit area on the landscape. And the green areas, that's the mature stands, that's kind of our baseline usage of water. And it's those yellow and red. The red is yellow and red are the ones we don't like because they're both higher than the green. And of the two, the red is even worse. And this is based on some research literature that we pulled together. So, example for Chaster Creek, if we look at this pie chart here, 50% of that watershed is covered in stands that are over 80 years old, which is positive from a low flow. However, we have, if you look at the yellow and the red, we have about 37% of the areas covered in those ages that really like to use water. And that's a considerable amount. And so what we end up doing is we look at these for all the different watersheds and we kind of come out with ratings. And so Chester came at about a moderate. And what we're saying is past disturbance has posed a moderate hazard on low flows, on declining summer flows in that watershed. In some of the others, the conditions are better. That means a low risk, and one of them we have a high risk, and the others are moderate as well. This is novel, and this is something that has not been tested widespread, but it's something we thought was worth showing because I know drought is an issue out here, and part of the reason is not only climate change, but there is a signature from land use as well. So what we do is, in terms of risk management, our recommendations to timber sales is those riparian areas, which are really the vital corridors of water in the summer. We want to retain as much vegetation there as possible. And so we're saying to recommend some really high levels of retention on these small streams. And part of the reason for that is the goal is to prevent colonization of deciduous, which use more water after you cut down some of the conifers, and increase the transpiration and evaporation and maintaining shade. So there's riparian protection that we want to do on all the streams, especially these S4 and S6, S4 to S6 channels. And in those areas that are away from the streams, in the upland areas, now we have two recommendations here that come from the research literature on low flows in the Pacific Northwest. And we debated these back and forth quite a bit and looked at what the data was telling us, and these were the two options. One is the openings have to stay less than 8 hectares. And the reasons for that is some energy. It's really the energy of wind and solar radiation, drying soils or not, and the trees themselves, they emit long wave radiation. So looking at that, there's a size limit. We're saying no bigger than 8 hectares from a low flow management perspective. The alternative is partial harvest and going in there and selecting a certain percentage of the stand and keeping a significant portion of the stand to maintain, for instance, the wind characteristics that would otherwise be in the area. Because wind is a real driver of the rain on snow, big floods. And so we want to avoid the wind patterns that bring in the warm, Pineapple Express warm air. If you can kind of keep those wind patterns more to the pre-disturbance state by partial harvest, that's another option. So we lay these out here, and these are the low flow risks. So now, if you recall, we had some flood or peak flow guidance, and now we have low flow, and now you have to combine the two. And this is where we're constraining timber sales even more. I know groundwater recharge is a really important aspect in this area. We know that there is, in this case, what we're talking about at the local level, when you remove the trees, you can increase the water table because you have excess water that's not being taken up by those trees. And that water is either going to go as runoff or it'll cause your water table to increase. In the summer, the type, age, and density of the riparian vegetation has a large effect on runoff patterns. So that's why we had already said the riparian protection is really utmost importance. The travel times. Now, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a hydrogeologist, and I'd love to communicate with your hydrogeologist if you think that's a viable option. But we understand there is some long travel times for some of these water, depending on where the source area is. And but for the most part, a lot of that water is on the order of decades old as it comes down the slope. That makes it incredibly difficult to tie it into a specific land use practice upslope. But what we're also trying to do with, and knowing that we don't understand all the details of the hydrogeology, we're trying to limit the impacts on the site level, the water balance that occurs when you cut trees down. If we can limit those at that level, the groundwater recharge will also be mitigated, the impacts on those. So what we're saying is here, if timber sales maintains the peak flow hazards, as we mentioned earlier, and maintains the low likelihood of adversely affecting the low flow hazards using those guidance we provided, the risks associated with the groundwater recharge should be low as well. So it all comes from the same water balance equation. Input from precipitation, trees use water, we're either going to have runoff or infiltration at that point. So we're trying to minimize the changes to that water balance on the site level. We've talked about floods, we talked about low flows. We have sediment. Sedimentation is an issue that we review. When we looked often we look at landslides and those are either natural or they get triggered by roads. We have the road surfaces themselves that can generate fine sediment, and we know that they've been issues in certain locations throughout the province. I have experience looking at that. Cut blocks themselves, you might think that that's a sediment source, but it usually isn't because there's so much woody debris and mulch effectively that protects those sources. So cut blocks are rarely a source for sediment unless you have, say, a trail or a road punched through it and running up and down it. But so in the area, we looked throughout the Seashell, the Roberts FSR, Forest Service Road, and its branch roads, and they're remarkably stable and robust road surfaces we have here, and I think that's something to be proud of. Some of the best I've seen in all the province, to be honest. And that's because there's a good road cap, and they keep good maintenance there. A lot of decent and good functional drainage infrastructure, appropriately sized culverts, for instance. There's always going to be risks. And when it crosses gullies, you're going to enter some of these thicker glacial sediments on the slopes, and that's where you do have some higher risks. We looked at about 89 crossings. That's a good sample of almost all the crossings we saw. And the risks that we generally saw with most of those were low. In the operating area, I won't speak to the areas below at the moment here. I mean, we do speak to them in the report, but there are various issues all out there. Because we walked, you saw all the hundreds of points. We saw the whole landscape effectively, and there are highways crossings that are surprisingly small for the amount of flow that we would expect. And there are some conditions out there that caused us some concern, and we put that in the report as well. Timber Sales obviously is not responsible for that, but they forwarded it also on to highways. So from a landslide perspective, we want to see, what are the landslide characteristics in this area? And looking back, all the way back from 47 till the present, we really only saw one period where there was active landslide activity, and that was in 1983. And that was in the Clough Creek drainage, where we had one of those landslides actually trigger a debris flow that went down. Since that time, we've had precipitation events that had exceeded that Clough Creek event, because that was driven by a big, probably an atmospheric event. But it's been exceeded many times since the Forest Practices Code. However, we don't really see any signature of that in terms of landslides on the landscape. So part of the speculation is, the Forest Practices Code that came in required an added level of diligence in terms of managing slope stability, better road engineering and so forth. And that may be part of the reason we saw that. So in terms of risk management options that we put forth in terms of sediment, we've identified a relatively low risk on the operating area, but always acknowledging there is always a residual risk when you're building roads and crossings. They should continue to employ their best management practices around streams and riparian zones, and they do have practices in their environmental management system and field procedures. And a relatively unusual recommendation here is that we recommend the works involving soil disturbance and large cut and fills, in addition to bridges and culverts, which they already do, be monitored by a qualified professional for environmental monitoring purposes, so that there's some eyes on the ground when the big soil movements occur. And we outline a number of practices in the report there, a lot more than I can speak to right now. So stream channel stability, it's controlled by the flood regime, bed and bank material, the stream bed, riparian conditions, and the stream gradient, and also past disturbances. And so as for the 8 watersheds that we looked at, many of them are relatively robust and stable. But the main exception is the lower Shasta Creek. That one is an alluvial channel, which means it's primarily in gravel, flowing through its own gravels. And there's a fair bit of sediment transport and scour that we noticed as we walk through there. So in the Mount Elphinstone South area, many of these riparian areas were historically logged or burned by wildfire. They're currently composed of a mix of deciduous and second growth conifers with varying amounts of understory vegetation. And the riparian vegetation is largely functional in providing bank stability, so the roots and the strength they provide, and shade. But we're predicting a lack of wood recruitment in the future into these creeks. And wood is an important element in streams to hold sediment and so forth. So as soon as you get a flood and some of those log jams break open, now you have slugs of sediment, and lo and behold, they'll be down at the bottom end of the creek. So wood in a creek is a good thing. And we're not seeing a lot of it in some places, and that's a bit of a concern that we've had. It means potentially seeing more sediment slugs coming down through the system. So in our recommendations to timber sales, we say that their riparian reserves should be established on the S1, S3, that's the larger streams, to avoid reduction of riparian function and mitigate erosion and sediment delivery. And on the smaller streams, this retention of mature overstory is important, and non-merchantable timber is recommended. And they already have established management zones, so to respect those. Okay, so we're coming near the end here. So some of the conclusions, given the complexity of this area, this assessment was conducted at a level of intensity and rigor above most assessments in the province. All stream catchments have been subject to a history of wildfire and logging. Historical records indicate widespread forest disturbance around 1900. The lower portion of the assessment area supports expanding residential and commercial development. The peak flow hazard is currently low in the operating area and ranges from low to high below the operating area. And given the distribution of forest ages, we're suggesting that summer low flows have been affected to varying degrees by past forest disturbance. If peak flow and low flow management recommendations are met, groundwater recharge is not expected to be measurably affected by future forest development. The resource roads are generally stable. And despite a couple of recent major atmospheric events, no recent landslides were noted. This may be a reflection of some of the better practices that we're dealing with roads these days. Current sediment hazard is low from landslides and roads. The streams have experienced past flooding. We're aware of that, and notable sediment movement through these. But for the most part, we're seeing relative stability. And the next phase of the assessment will involve a review of specific block plans to see how they align with the recommendations we've put forth. So this is kind of our chance to tell them what we think we want. They'll come back and then we'll say, does that reflect what we said? And we'll say yes or no. So some of the recommendations, Yeah, some of the approach, we discussed this earlier, the approach of we're trying to maintain a low hazard on the operating area within their control and avoiding an increase in hazards downstream. To keep those peak flow hazards low, we're saying 20% is the cap. We don't want to go over. And we're recommending that this information be shared with other agencies, which I think may have already been done. To reduce those adverse effects of harvesting on summer low flows, we recommend prioritizing high retention around small streams, maintaining opening sizes less than 8 hectares, or implementing partial harvest, selective harvest methods. We recommend that terrain stability assessments continue to guide forest development planning where harvesting or road construction is planned on slope gradients exceeding 50%. And a number of recommendations to reduce the potential forest development effects on sediment yield are provided in the report. And this includes recommending that works involving potential soil disturbance or large cut and fills within 15 meters of a stream channel, as well as the installation of bridges and major culverts, be monitored by a qualified professional. So that brings us to the end of our presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, and I think we already had some questions that were
That's great.
under the perception it was the end, so talking about the whole thing. But we're open to more questions on the final material you just presented. And I can't see hands up online, so if anybody's online, just speak up. I'll ask, just process-wise, you made a couple comments about, about the concerns about hydrogeology, and I mean, obviously that's huge concern for the town, and that based on talking to other well owners, that you're putting it on the table to think about, I think is what you said, and you'd love to communicate with our hydrogeologist. Well, like what in the process, phase 2 and 3, where could that fit? I mean, you've already got your options here. What more information would you be able to get, and what influence could that possibly have?
That's a good question. I mean, we do have that 2013 report. We don't have a 2022 update. I mean, I'd be glad to get a copy if you're willing to provide that, and see if that would inform us, right? It is a challenge because we're crossing some disciplines here, right? So forest hydrology and hydrogeology have traditionally been rather distinct topics of study and investigation, and the interaction between the two is rather novel, and as far as I know, is very limited across the province. So, I mean, I'm always willing to speak to someone who can inform me about something. So, and if it's something, if there's something that we're assuming that may not be correct, I'm all ears. And the report is in draft form, so we have the ability to change things.
Okay. Any other questions? So, okay, Councillor Kroll.
Thank you, Mayor White. On several occasions, you've mentioned partial harvesting or selective harvesting. We've had presentations made to us with fire smarting and how on occasions the partial harvesting is, a better practice to follow. So from the timber sales point of view, is it something that is off the table or in restricted because of at what point could you say, yes, we could do this, that it's a viable practice?
What we are doing, there is some partial harvesting that goes on in the, what do they call it?
The research forest.
In the research forest. So we've been implementing prescriptions for partial harvesting there over we did the second entry into that partial harvest regime 2 years ago. So partial harvesting is going on now. The thing with partial harvesting, the more partial harvesting you have, the more roads you have to build to get the same amount of volume. And as you heard Lars say, roads are the biggest source of sediment in any watershed analysis. So there's a balancing act there. And it's more costly to harvest in a partial harvest system. But I think you'll see as we move into the phase 3 analysis, we're going to be proposing at least one block that'll have some partial harvesting in it. So that'll be a new direction that we're going in. And that will inform how we move forward. You know, whether we can get somebody to take that timber sale license on, and how effective it is for licensing. So, you know, it's always a diversity of approaches is always a good thing. If we, you know, don't go one way or the other 100%. But we do have to balance that road density piece. And because that, in a lot of hydrologists' eyes, is the biggest issue with sedimentation in watersheds.
Okay, I'll ask another question. I wanted to ask about the Squamish Nation's role in the processes too. You know, I understand. I just got
So we're
one,
meeting
two.
with the Squamish.
Yeah.
Nation.
I mean, is it a similar kind of because just with
Yeah, I'd say we're going to deliver the same presentation
Yeah.
to the Squamish Nation. We have a pretty solid relationship with Squamish Nation because we operate in Squamish Forest District or in Sea to Sky District. So yeah, we're going to present this to them as well.
So that's still to come.
Yeah, it's still to come
okay.
next week, I think.
Other questions from council or staff?
Mayor,
Okay.
a quick question. Are we going to receive another presentation of the third phase? If they're coming back? Because that's, I understand that now the CTS will incorporate all this recommendation specifically to the blocks.
Yeah,
Are
the phase 3 piece of this, which is the block level consultation, that will be done through our annual operating plan process that I'm sure you've received packages for before. So we put out a proposal for their next 5 years worth of operations, which has blocks in various stages of development. So we plan to do that in June, July of this year and those blocks that are in this area will incorporate the phase 3 analysis.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Is there anyone from the audience who has any questions as well? I mean, we have a couple directors from the SCRD who will have opportunities tomorrow. Suzanne.
Yeah, I was curious. I listened to we had a great chat this morning with the BCTS guys and we've been emailing with Lars and care about this for a while. As I'm listening to this conversation, I'm wondering about at phase 3, whether or not it would be appropriate for BCTS to send a direct referral to the town Gibsons on the proposed blocks, not just through the annual operating plan engagement, but to actually get peer review by Waterline on the proposals to see how the proposed development, once that's all laid out, because this is a conversation about recommendations about how you might develop a logging plan for a particular block. So I just wonder if there's an opportunity for BCTS to have those block plans peer reviewed at their own cost, not at the town's cost, because that's how they operate. Because if a developer comes in and they have to get a peer review on their study, then the town didn't pay for it.
Well, we're paying these guys to peer review it, so you can't pay everybody, unfortunately. We have no problems if you guys want to get Waterline involved in looking we don't have any issues with that, but we're relying on Robbie and Lars here to provide us input.
Just a point of clarification with respect, the difference between hydrogeological peer review and hydrological peer review is it's a striking difference. And you said, like, Lars has made that
No,
point.
I agree with that. But, yeah, no.
It's just a suggestion. Might answer some of the worries about risk and impacts on recharge.
Yeah, well, I think from our perspective, our staff is going to be looking at this further and engaging you on the 2022 update. So that could evolve from that, further water line involvement for sure. So I think that's the end of our presentation now. So thank you very much, and thank you for your willingness to continue to engage in this and receive some input and from the town and town staff, and our the town and possibly our town consultant. We'll see about that too. So procedurally here, our next special meeting of council will be March 28th, in a week at 3 p.m. And I want to thank everyone from our staff and council as well for doing 2 days in a row here, which is unusual. But this was when BC Timber Sales was coming, so we've had two 3 o'clock meetings in a row this week. And I'm looking for a motion to adjourn. Moved by Councillor Kroll, seconded Councillor Thompson. All those in favor? And the motion carries.
Thank you.
I'm usually the first one to make a motion to adjourn.
You don't count.
Yeah. Not here anyway.
Chelsea, when, are you gonna be at the meeting tomorrow? You're gonna be part of this traveling road show?
I am, yeah.
Excellent. I was wondering when you're gonna be